If you have an old Willys Jeep and your wiring harness is a mess, then this video is for you. Today we're going to install this harness from Kaiser Willys into my FC-150. Kaiser has more than just the harness. They have all the supporting parts too, so I decided to add turn signals. When you order your harness, make sure you specify whether you plan on adding turn signals or not. The harnesses are a little bit different. I'm also doing a new ignition switch. This is the flasher to go with the turn signal switch. New temperature sender and fuel sending unit. All of their harnesses come with these very easy to read and thorough wiring diagrams. So they have a numerical list that says what color it is, where it's located, and what it goes to, as well as a standard diagram showing you everything. So it's really well done and will make this job a breeze. Before we can put the new components in, we have to tear out all the old junk. As with many of our old Jeeps, underneath my dashboard is a mess. There's a lot of repairs, splices, and things that shouldn't be there. So to get started, I'm simply going to pull out the engine cover and probably unbolt the dash so I can get under there and just start. I'm not going to cut it out, but I'm going to remove everything and try to get the harness out in as one piece if I can. That will help me with installation of the new one. I always encourage you to take lots of pictures. You can label things if you want. Any kind of documentation you can do while you're disassembling is going to save you some time and headaches. So I'm a big fan of cell phone pictures, so I just get my phone and a light and just take as many photos as I can. And anything that I'm not sure about, I might mark the location or any details I can, because things are a lot easier to take apart than they are to put back together. So we try to make reassembly as successful as possible. One other thing I forgot to mention is always disconnect your battery. For this job, I think that would be obvious, but I do want to remind you of that. We don't want any sparking or any fires going on. Next step is to just start removing all the connectors and pulling the harness out. Just wanted to show you guys some of the beautiful wiring features of this Jeep. I would imagine most of yours have similar things, lots of electrical tape, and I think it's unlawful to have less than 3 wire nuts on every Willys Jeep. Here's my harness under the dash. It looks like a mess. There's some oddball connectors here and there, but this Jeep was kept relatively stock, so it's not the worst I've seen, but there's a lot of splices and wires that aren't the right color, and nothing in the cluster works, so definitely going to be a nice upgrade. Alright, there's what's left of my wiring harness, including the zip ties, wasp's nest, wire nuts. It's all out. Things are looking a lot more clean in here. The only wires that remain are the ones for these marker lights. As far as I know, well, stay tuned, but I think we reused these. Unfortunately, mine were all, the ends were cut off and they were just crimped and taped. So they may have had loops or like real connectors on the end, but we'll have to address that. When I get to that point, I really tried to not cut the main harness as I was removing it, but unfortunately whoever worked on this before me put this really thick plastic loom over the original harness, because the original main harness, that's not even original, would have only been about this big, which it's probably about 5/8 of an inch in diameter, and that's enough to slide through the hole in the firewall and get down through everywhere you need to be. But this has been spliced and hacked so many times and wrapped with this big thick sheath that I couldn't pull it up through the original hole. So I had to cut it, and it really shouldn't matter. I just wanted to keep it intact. Yeah, so I cut it right there. I wanted to keep it intact just so I had something to reference when I was putting it back together. So other than that, I mean, the disassembly is pretty straightforward. Just disconnect all your connectors. These little loops go inside to a junction block, and then the plug and ground are on that. There's a pretty heavy duty grommet that's on the inside, and you push that down through the headlight bucket. So let me show you that. When you get to the point where you're removing the headlight portion of the harness, just remove, there's 3 little screws that hold this trim ring on. You're gonna take those off, then your bulb comes off, then you just unplug the bulb from this socket, and then this is in there sort of like that. So from the inside of the bucket, so if you have a CJ, this would be under the hood. On an FC, it's inside where you sit. You push this down through, and these have little stud terminals that go to a junction block. So push that right through, and this comes out through the headlight. And then for the marker light, it's going to be this blue and yellow. And like I said, mine are not original, or they're original lamps and sockets, but the wires have been cut. So luckily I have enough here, but I will have to add on something to connect those. So I'm going to wait until the harness is all in, but you don't have to take this socket apart, and don't cut these wires. Now I'm getting to an exciting part where I can kind of get rid of some of this old stuff. I'm not going to throw it out yet in case I need anything from it, but I'm going to get it out of the way, throw it in a box, get rid of the bee's nest, and start laying out my new harness and just see where the best starting point is. What I'm doing now is just going through and laying out all the harnesses. There's different sections of this harness that obviously go in different places. Don't get overwhelmed, that's the main thing. Just do one piece at a time. There's really, there's many different ways you could do this, so there's really no wrong way. So just pick a spot and start going from there. Let's get started. Each of the headlight buckets has its own harness. The shorter one obviously on the driver's side, longer one on the passenger side. So I'm just going to find the opening, pass it through. It's set up and ready to go with the ground wire. And so I'm gonna feed that back through, and each one is pre-terminated and ready to go, just exactly like the original. I'm back here in the cab. I just wanted to show you how I ran the wiring harness. If you happen to be working on an FC, perhaps this will be some help. So the steering wheel would have been right here. This is the parking brake. There's a big hole with a grommet where the parking brake cable goes through. I'm not entirely sure that's where it's supposed to go. But that's where the old harness was, and that's where I put it, so it goes in through there and then down along the grill. Now if you can see that split in the harness, so this is at the back of the engine. The piece on the right goes to the taillights. The piece on the left goes over to the starter and alternator and distributor. And this comes over to the starter, so the solenoid that starts the engine, and the distributor and the regulator and all that. The part of that harness that split off to the right comes out here. So there's these little round plastic things. That's just a junction that goes to the rear harness. These go to the taillights, so the back of the vehicle. It's rather crowded and hard to see back here, but there's a hole in the cross member, so I'm right above the rear axle. And so this is the drawbar brace. So your harness will pass through that hole on the driver's side. So the rear part of the harness, whether it's a CJ or FC or whatever, will be on the driver's side. And then once you make it to the rear, you'll notice there's another junction. One goes out to the driver's side taillight, and the other way goes to the passenger side. The FC is a little tricky because I have the PTO and the counterweight, but it just splits and goes on top of all that. So on your standard CJ, it would go behind the bumper here. Once you've run everything, you should have a pigtail coming out on the driver's side, and that will go to our existing tail lights. Same thing on the passenger side. This is the longer tail of that rear harness. Because moving right along, another part of the harness is the high beam section of the harness. So if you notice, this is separate, but it's still, you can tell it's obviously a more substantial part of this kit, and it has a bulb socket for the cluster. So that goes right down through the floor to your high beam switch. It also has the horn wire. If you have an FC, it's going to look something like this. So you can see right there is the high-low switch for the high beams. That's these 3 studs or 4 studs. And then our wires for the horn, which on the FC is down here under the driver's feet, and on a CJ would be under the, or in the engine compartment. The horn wire exits the bottom of the steering column right there. Now that we have all the harnesses run, we're just simply looking at the color. So you're going to find the color in your harness. It gives you the gauge, the thickness. So the yellow 16 gauge on, number 1 on this diagram goes to the light switch and tail light terminal. So it's all labeled really well, but the most important thing is make sure you know which section of the harness you're working on. So this says main harness, because there's a 16 gauge yellow wire here. You might come down to the parking light harness and find another 16 gauge yellow. So this diagram is broken down into several different parts. So you have the main harness, left park light, right park light, coil, cigarette lighter. This is the high beam switch harness, the rear harness. So just make sure you know which harness you're looking at when you're referencing the colors. So from here it's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to grab my cluster and my diagram. I'm going to start with this main harness, and it's just a matter of hooking things up. I'm going to put the bulb sockets go in here, and they're all labeled. So you have an amp light, an oil light, and then 2 that are just bezel lights. So, but each Jeep model is different, because the CJs and the MBs, they have the lights on the dash that point down at the gauges, whereas the CJ3B, later ones and up, have an illuminated gauge. So just start hooking those up. And then the light switch is a pretty critical part of this job, because there's no fuses in these Jeeps. You may pull it apart and think, where's the fuse block? It actually has a thermal breaker, so that's this little guy on the back. So make sure when you're ordering, if you want to keep it original, Kaiser has these switches. This is your main breaker for the whole Jeep, which is how they did it back then. So if this gets overloaded, you'll hear it snap and it'll break the connection, and then it'll reset. Once you take away the power or the short, it'll reset. You can fix the problem, and then you should be good to go. So you don't need to carry extra fuses as long as this relay or this breaker doesn't go bad. You're also going to see several sections of your diagram that are going to say terminal block. So this is the terminal block on a CJ. They are on the fender on the driver's side. It's just what connects the 2 harnesses. On the FC, it's under the dash right behind the steering wheel, and all this does is make an insulated junction of the 2 halves of your harness. So it's a really simple part. You can get this at Kaiser as well. This one's in pretty good shape, so I'm going to reuse the original one, which is pretty incredible because it's made of cardboard. If you get overwhelmed, just stop, take a break. Just do 1 wire at a time. Find your harness, find your location, find where it's going, hook up 1 wire, maybe use a pencil, something you can erase, cross that wire out, move on to the next one. Just take it 1 thing at a time, and you'll have no problem. It's a pretty simple system, and just follow the instructions and you'll be good to go. I'm not going to bore you to death watching me hook up each one of these, but I'm going to get some of this done, and then I'll check back in a minute and show you where I'm at. I have everything hooked up and finished. I think I did it right. I did label some wires. I'm installing a turn signal switch. This is the chrome metal housing switch from Kaiser Willys, so I'll put a link in the description to all of these parts, but also if you have questions on how to wire the flasher relay and the turn signal switch, I did a full video on just that, so that may help you. But the harness really makes it simple because all the wires are here. They go to the parking lights and the tail lights. So all you're doing is following the diagram that comes with your turn signal switch, and it's super easy, and everything matches up with the Kaiser Willys harness. I left the steering wheel and dashboard off so that I could make sure everything works before I put it all back together. That's what I was saying about this speedometer. It's kind of nice. It bolts up from the back side, so you can hook up all the wires without having to reach up under the dash. So I have the ignition switch, turn signals, the headlight, flasher, the heater's hooked up. Everything should be ready to test. This video really wasn't intended for me to show you how to hook up every single wire. The way these instructions are laid out, it's extremely simple. You know, your oil pressure sensor wire goes to the oil pressure sensor. The the high beam wire goes to high beam, and so on and so forth. So you can read and you can follow this. My job here was to show you anything that's really not in here. Some things that I encountered that tripped me up. I'm not a big wiring guy. It's one of my least favorite jobs. This harness wasn't too bad, but there were a few things that I wanted to highlight and make note of. Things that either weren't in the instructions or were unique to my install. So that's what this is about, to show the product, show a bit of the install, but also give you some of the tips that you might not get just from the paper instructions. Bottom line, if I can do it, you can do it. This is the headlight switch. It's one of the main components of the Willys electrical system because there's no fuse block. It has that thermal relay on the back that we talked about earlier. So this is a really important part, and your very first instruction on the first page of the harness, the main harness diagram, it's going to say wire number 1, 16 gauge yellow, goes to light switch tail light terminal. So then you look at this and you think, well, which one is that? And on these instructions, it doesn't show any picture of the switch. And if you Google it, you're probably not going to find this particular switch. So I think this was used on the CJ5s and the FCs, but only for certain years. So I really wanted to focus on the terminals for this switch so that you didn't have to figure it out the way I did. So number 1, yellow wire, says goes to light switch tail light terminal. That is this one. And obviously you can power the system up and pull the switch, but when you have wires laying all around, it's really not that convenient to put power to this before you have everything figured out. So this is the yellow wire number 1. Then the next one on our list is park lights. So it'll say blue, and it gives you the gauge and it shows you the location, but it says parking lights. And this switch isn't labeled with anything like that. So this second one here, towards the back of the switch, is for the parking lights. Then the green one is for headlights. So those are the 3 main terminals that really aren't shown. And then this little screw on the side here is for the cluster lights. So there's 2 little light bulbs on the cluster. This is one part of the dimmable switch, and that will light up your gauge cluster. So that was something that I had to stop and look up, and it's not in the book, so hopefully that helps you. Circuit breaker, you'll see inner and outer. So this is the circuit breaker inner and circuit breaker outer. And just remember, the outer is the main power feed to the whole system, and that's this outermost post on that thermal breaker. So that's important to remember. So inner, outer. Hope that helps. Another part of the system that is not shown in great detail is the horn relay. So this is an important part of the system that I had to also look up because my harness was such a mess that I couldn't really see what was what. So this is part of the, it's called the high beam harness. It's the little side harness that goes to the foot switch. So the middle terminal here is your 12 volt power in. This is hot all the time. That's why you can blow the horn even when the key's not in the vehicle. So this goes right to the outer post of the thermal breaker. So that's the center one. On the right you have this smaller black wire. That goes down to the little wire that comes out of the bottom of the column. So that's the one that comes from the horn button. And then this larger one right here, when that triggers, when you push the button, this triggers it, this feeds it, and then this sends power to your horn. So this one goes to the actual positive side of your horn. Those are the main things with this harness. The rest of it is super self-explanatory. And if you ever have questions in any of these videos, you can just comment below, and I try to keep up with all the comments, and I'll happily answer them. Or you can DM me on any of my social media pages, or call Kaiser Willys, and Jason or Mike will be happy to explain any questions you have about this system. Anytime you're working on wiring, it's really important to use something that's insulated and protected to keep the harness from rubbing through any of your components or coming down and touching the hot exhaust. So I have these little cable clamps along the body. This originally had some tabs that are rusted off that would keep the harness up out of harm's way. On the FC, there are these shift rods that slide back and forth the whole time you're driving. So you just really want to make sure that you're not going to rub the harness on anything that could damage it. You also have to be extra careful underneath the vehicle to make sure it's up out of the way of PTO shafts, drive shafts, exhaust, and up nice and tight so that things on the trail won't snag your harness and cause problems. This harness was plenty long that I was able to tie it into my taillights without any issues. I didn't have to add any wires, and I was even able to slide the wiring harness sheath right up to the taillight, giving it a nice clean look. Now that everything's buttoned up, I'm making sure that there's no hot terminals exposed that are going to touch anything and short it out. I hooked the battery back up and kind of watched to make sure no smoke was escaping. And now we're ready to fire it up and make sure that it's working. So I did check with a test light to make sure I have power going to my coil and distributor. And I think we're ready to go. So hopefully if I did it all right, it fires right up. Always make sure you have the tools and stuff cleaned up in your engine bay so that it doesn't get caught up in the belts. Make sure it's in neutral because we're crawling around doing different things and you don't want to put a hole in your garage. So let's see if she fires up. Alright, I call that a win. The amp light should be on right when you turn the key on, and then as the alternator or generator spins up, that should go out and show you that it's charging. Obviously the engine's cold, but my temperature gauge moved up from like buried up to the letter C, cold. So hopefully we'll let it run and see that moving. Same way with the fuel gauge as well. Yeah, so I think I'm happy enough that I can pop the dash back on. I did want to show you the engine side of the harness. It just looks so much better in here now with the wire nuts and rat's nest all gone. So this is a super simple section of the harness. You have two wires over here. One goes to the temperature sensor. The other goes to the positive side of the coil. And then from the coil to the distributor, which I didn't have to change any of that. That wire stayed there. And then down here you just have this light blue wire goes to your key. So that's when you're cranking, that activates the solenoid. And then this large power wire here is what where the power comes from the alternator back to the battery, because your battery hooks up right here, so that always stays hot. I thought this would be a good time to show, you know, if you have a generator in the stock system, it comes with a voltage regulator harness, so you'd hook that up just as it shows you in the diagram. But what if you have a 12-volt alternator conversion like this? Well, good news is that just makes it even more simple to hook up. So these are your main wires. The one goes to the starter, the other back to the ignition system. So these just go right on the big stud on the back of your alternator. So you're not using any of that regulator harness. Then you simply have a jumper that goes from the big stud to the lower terminal. So this is a 3-wire alternator, which is the kind I prefer for this setup. So I don't know if you can see, that's just a jumper wire back to the stud. And then the top one, the top blade, goes to the gray wire on your engine harness, and that is that would have gone to the regulator, but that works perfectly to go to your amp light. So this is what will show you whether it's charging or not. Always hang on to your old diagrams. I made some notes on mine. Put it in file, and you never know if you have to pull something apart and work on it. Same way with your turn signal switch. It's just good to keep those around. That concludes the Kaiser Willys wiring harness install on this Willys FC-150. If your Jeep needs a new wiring harness, go to kaiserwillys.com, check out their catalog. They have harnesses for pretty much every model of Willys Jeep out there. They're all really good quality. It'd be the same harness that you would have gotten from Walk's 4-wheel drive, so if you're a big Walk's fan, you're still going to get the same quality harness from Kaiser. One little tip I want to give you is when you're on the website and you click on a switch or a relay, scroll down to the description, and many of them will have a diagram that you can click on, and it'll expand and show you some things that might not necessarily be in your diagram that comes with the harness. As with all my videos, every part I used will be in the description below. If you have any questions about your install, don't hesitate to ask me. I'll try to help you. If I can't answer you, I will find the answer for you. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.